yeah, so this is going to be kind of an intro to Shiny with some R Markdown and stuff mixed in there. But first, I've already heard a bit about ProCogia. I want to introduce myself. I'm Mike Garcia. I'm a data scientist with ProCogia. Um, as you've heard, we're an end-to-end data science company. Everything from talking about you know advisory, regulatory compliance, kind of the planning aspect to data engineering, and then through to reporting, doing the data science and analytics that then informs the entire process, and kind of think that is a loop that goes back. Kind of where I fall is more on these last two, doing like visualizations, running models, figuring out how to use the data to answer a particular business or science question. And that's going to be kind of the focus of the workshop today is using particularly Shiny for that visualization and turning your R code into something interactive that your end user can engage with. So some quick overview and some expectations. The workshop goal is to understand first off what Shiny is, the basics of how you structure a Shiny application, and then how to make your own Shiny app. And if we have time, I will show you how to incorporate Shiny into some dashboards with the Flex dashboard package. Assumptions, not a lot on the R background, just some general familiarity will be helpful. Like what a function is, how to load it, call it, data sets and packages. Absolutely no prior experience in Shiny or any kind of web technologies is assumed at all. We're going to use, Shiny is heavily visual, so we're going to use ggplot for visualization. If you haven't used it before, that's fine. And I'll cover a little bit of this in kind of our first warm-up module. But of course, if you tend to use base R for plotting, you can absolutely incorporate base R plots into Shiny. Kind of our general structure that I'll try to hold to is, this quick intro, quick warm up, to kind of show you some, get you refreshed on ggplot if that's newer to you. We're gonna kind of build up a Shiny app in layers. Then we're gonna go to a bit fancier app with some more complex features. And then we'll do a demo at the end with the Flex dashboard package. So first off, what is Shiny? By definition is, it's a framework that allows our users to create interactive web apps without knowing anything about web design. So you don't really have to think about all the underlying web technologies. You just use R, and it's kind of similar to learning a new R package. Okay, I lied there a little bit. You don't really need to know basic web design, but just a few basic things is helpful. So here's the one slide that I'm going to talk about web design. As I said, it abstracts away the underlying technologies of modern web design, which are three of them. There's HTML, which sure sounds pretty familiar. If you haven't worked with it before, it's essentially the building block of a web page. And your web browser interprets it and shows you the nice reformatted websites that we're all used to. There's CSS, or cascading style sheets, and this separates the content that's in the HTML, what your web app is doing or what your website is doing, with how it looks. So you can control those independently. You can change the content, or you can update the theme, but they're not tied together, they're independent. And then finally, there's JavaScript, which is a scripting language that enables the interactivity within a web page or a web app. And typically this is executed in the user's browser rather than on any central server. And the idea with Shiny is that it takes all of this and wraps it up into an easy to use interface and framework. So for the workshop today, we're going to be using RStudio Cloud. You should have received an invite to the workspace and been able to open up your own session that's essentially a clone or a derivative of this project here. If you haven't, put a question into the chat, and one of our TAs can help you sort that out. And just as a note too, kind of throughout the entire workshop, if you have questions, pop them into the chat. Either a TA will get back to you. I'll try to pop in and monitor it from time to time to see if there's things that would be good to talk about overall. Yeah, we'll keep this as interactive as possible. So first thing we're going to do is start with the warm up. Actually, I'm going to check in really quick just to make sure that people are generally able to access this. If you're having problems accessing any of this material, if you could throw that in the chat now, just so I don't continue on if most people are not able to follow along.
Yeah, Samantha, I'm not sure if we can see the chat, so it's a little tricky, but I do have a link to share to the actual RStudio Cloud space. We did invite most of the people that registered ahead of the workshop today, so you should have got an email that gives you a link to the project. But if you didn't see that, we have a general link that is open that should take you directly into the space.
And I can drop a link to that in the chat for everyone to see. Let me just pull that up and I will put that in the chat.
Okay. Just give me 2 seconds.
And I think most people were able to. I saw that there were like over 100 people had created their own project for this. So I think we should be good to go. But I just wanted to clarify first. All right, so yeah, let's start out in this. So from the main folder, click on the warm up. I'll go warm up, RMD. So this RMD is an R Markdown document. I won't go into a lot of the details of what R Markdown specifically is, but it's essentially a way to integrate your code with text in a literate programming paradigm. And then there's a lot of other features that we'll add in for interactivity with either visualizations and then ultimately Shiny. So we can kind of go through this in just like a notebook sort of format and run these a few lines at a time. So I'm going to load some packages. This is a Flex dashboard package that we'll eventually use. This OpenFDA is just a package that interfaces with the OpenFDA API to get some data. You don't really need to know the specifics about that, but fun to play around with if you haven't seen it before. And then just some tidyverse packages for manipulation and plotting, and then the GG themes plot package as well. So we'll start out with this is a helper function to gather some data from that OpenFDA API. So we're going to grab, it's going to be a function of gender, brand name. So this will be the drug brand name, and age. And yeah, this goes through and submits a query, does some filtering on those variables, brand, gender, and age. Says that we want a total count. We're going to limit it to the top 10, and then we're going to submit the query. And then this just does some formatting to give the age that we want, or to put the age in the correct format. Cool. So now let's actually get to doing something. So we're going to start with drug Keytruda. And I think there might be better ways to do this, parameterized reports, etc. And that's exactly right. We're going to build up to that. So right now we're just going to say, we're going to hard code it. We're going to say we're looking at Keytruda, and we're going to look specifically at 20 to 65. So you see that create function just creates it, puts it in the format that is required by the API. We're going to run that get adverse function. Going to combine the data. So remember the R bind is stacking the data, so it's row bind. And if we want to take a quick look at what that looks like, use view. And here we have a term column. These are adverse events, the number, total count, and the gender. Cool, so we've got some data. Let's move ahead and start plotting that. So we're going to cover we're not really going to focus on teaching tidyverse, teaching ggplot, but I'm just going to go over a few kind of key things to either refresh your memory, or if you're new to this, the key things to follow along. So you see we start with the data set, and we're just going to read you can read this code just, one line at a time, thinking of it as, we're starting with the data set, and then we're doing group by, and then we're summarizing, etc. This operator here is the pipe. So it'll link things together, starting with the data set, and then we're gonna apply this next function to adverse, and then we're gonna apply summarize to the summarize the results of these two together, and so on. You can see we're grouping by term, which is that adverse event, and we're going to summarize. We're going to get the total count within adverse event, and then we're going to move on and start building up the layers of our plot. So, ggplot stands for the grammar of graphics. It's this layered kind of philosophy to how to build up a visualization. So, start out with just kind of empty ggplot object, and we're going to add in a bar chart. We're going to tell it that we want, we're doing something a little fancy here to make the ordering how we want it, but we're going to tell it to put this on the x-axis, the count on the y-axis. We're going to flip the coordinates around. So instead of vertical bars, it's going to be horizontal. We're going to give it some labels, apply a minimal theme, and we just keep adding these on top of each other. So we can do all of this in one pipeline, and we get our graphic. Cool. So, but that's just static. We're going to learn how to make this interactive and visual. Okay, so yeah, let's maybe take this one step further and do it by gender. So this is pretty much the same code, but we've added one new line here, and that's the facet wrap. So instead of repeating, copying and pasting all this over again and doing it again, filtering to male and then just filtering to female, we can add the facet wrap, and we're also telling it to fill the bars or do a color by gender. So now we've got female on the left here, male on the right, and showing the distribution of adverse events. So that's pretty much what you really need to know about ggplot. Just think of it as you're building up all of these layers. We're going to have different plots using different geoms for different graphics, few things, but you won't really need to write any of that code yourself if you're new to ggplot and are kind of learning that alongside Shiny. Of course, this whole thing is our markdown document, so I've kind of gone through it as a notebook, but you can hit knit and you can see it as an HTML. All right, so now that we're a little bit warmed up, let's go on and actually talk about Shiny. That's what we said we were going to talk about, so let's dive in. So I've got a series of templates here, and they just progressively build up to a working Shiny app. So this first one is the absolute minimal Shiny app that you can have, and it has 4 components. First off, you have to call the library. You have to call Shiny. So library Shiny. You have this fluid page function, which is empty. There's no arguments in it yet, and we're assigning the output of that function to this U. Giving it the name UI. And similar, we've got this server, which is a function that we're defining, and it takes 3 inputs. Input, output, and session. The names of the arguments. And then it's just currently just an empty function. And then finally, we're calling this Shiny app on the UI in the server. So this is a fully working Shiny app, but it's really boring. And I'm gonna say one thing you can do here, if you click on next to Run App, if you run in window, it'll pop up a new window. Run external, it'll pop up in a browser window. You can also select View or Pane, and I'm going to do that just for presentation ease. Hide the environment, and now it'll show up in this View or Pane here. So I could run that, and yep, it says it's listing on this local host on this port, and it's busy, it's doing something. Look over the view, it's just empty. Of course, it's empty because we haven't actually done anything yet. Let's go ahead and stop that. So I'll talk a little bit about just the purpose of these different components, and then we'll actually start putting in some content to solidify, what these different things are doing. So the UI is where we're going to put everything related to what you might think of as like the design or the look and feel of the app. So different buttons and sliders and ways of input, kind of the overall layout, the structure of the app is going to go right there. The server is where most of your R code is going to go. That's going to be the code that's generating the plots, that's maybe filtering according to some drop-down menu that's selected. And then Shiny App is actually what's running the app. So if you don't have that last line, your app won't run. There's a quick note too, kind of a helpful tip that it's often useful when you're either building a complex app to kind of just build like a little component of it by itself, or maybe you're going through some exercises and you get really tired of like copying this boilerplate over and over again. RStudio has something called a snippet that's built in. If you just type in Shiny, and you'll see this Shiny app snippet that pops up, that'll actually just populate your code, your menu with that boilerplate. So that's a quick way if you just want to test what what a particular input or something does. Cool. So we'll stop that app and open up the next one. So this one, just point out, we haven't changed anything in the lower bit. So we still have this empty server and the Shiny app. What we've modified now is we've added something to the UI. So this is kind of where we start to think about, what do we want the app to look like? When you're actually doing this in practice for something more complicated, it's often helpful to sit down with a pen and paper and actually sketch out what you want it to look like. Which components, which visualizations do you want in which areas? And it can get a little overwhelming if you try to start building up, or a little complex if you don't have like a good vision of what you want it to look like. So we've got something like a title, this thing called sidebar layout, a couple panels. Let's just run this and see what it looks like. Cool. So we've got some material here. We've got our title is going up here. This is kind of interesting. We see the sidebar layout, and we've specified the position left, although it's kind of in the center. And we've got it within that sidebar layout. You can see that function comprises like lines 8 through 16. We've got two panels within, one for the inputs and one for the main results, but they're all kind of stacked on top of each other. So I'm going to give you a moment or two to kind of play around with this. I've got a couple exercises at the bottom. Try moving the sidebar to the right. Maybe play around with the order of this. Just kind of play around for a minute or so and get a feel for this. And if kind of curious, if anyone has any ideas of why this might be just stacked and why it's not actually putting it on the left. And are we actually able to see the chat, the questions?
Unfortunately not, I don't think. For some reason, it's based on operating system. So far, though, I've seen questions for getting the link. Let's see, let me look in and see if there's any other questions in here that you might be able to answer besides getting the link. Let's see. And we've got one question saying, are you going to be covering Shiny modules in today's presentation?
Good question. Unfortunately, I don't think there's enough time to go from absolute intro to Shiny all the way to Shiny modules in a 90-minute workshop. I wish I could. So if anyone's curious about what that is, it's just a way of kind of breaking up your codes here, getting less repetitive. You might have like a particular interface, and it would drop down this, drop down menu that creates this visualization, and you want to incorporate that into either different parts of your app or different apps entirely, you can kind of modularize your code. And if you've written a lot of code, you're probably used to doing that. You write a function to do something rather than copying and pasting the same thing over again. So there's Shiny modules help address that. But yeah, we won't have time to get to that, unfortunately.
Awesome, thank you, Mike. I'm seeing if there's any other questions. And are you going to be covering interactive plots in Shiny today?
Yes, that will definitely. In fact, we're on part 2 out of 5 here, and by the time we get to 5, we will have a basic interactive plot.
Excellent. Perfect. And so those are all the questions that I can see coming in right now. So if you want to keep on going, and at any point, if you'd like to pause, and I can read out some questions as well.
Sounds great. Yeah, so yeah, let's just kind of go through this and say, let's move this to the right and see what happens. Kind of unsurprisingly, it looks the same as if it was on the left, and it was centered wise on the right. Now, maybe you're opening this in a different window or in a browser, and you may have seen something entirely differently. The reason for this is that the Shiny recognizes what size screen you're looking at. So it's looking at just this kind of right portion of my screen, and it is viewing that because it's small. It's kind of viewing that almost like a mobile device or a tablet. And if it placed it on the left, everything would be really scrunched, except for especially when you have a visualization in there. But notice if I drag this out far enough, okay, now it's at some point here it decides, okay, that's a big enough screen, and it lets me do what I want to. But instead of having to specify a different interface for a mobile device and a tablet and maybe a small Surface Pro and then a huge desktop, it just it's smart, and it says, okay, you probably actually don't want your full interface here. I'm just going to stack them because that's going to look better. But yeah, you can see now that's on the right. If it's on the left, you can hit reload the app, so you don't have to actually stop and reload. But now, okay, now our inputs are over on the left. Cool. So that's all the interface. We haven't really done anything to make it interactive at all yet. It's still just a static document essentially. So let's build this up a little bit. We still have this, you can see now it's getting more complicated, but this is still a pretty simple app. And this is why it's a good idea to sketch things out in advance, rather than just starting to put things in and having it snowball on you. You end up with a lot of spaghetti code. So we still got our title, still got our sidebar layout. And now instead of, we've got our panel, sidebar panel, and a main panel. And within those, so these used to just have a little bit of text. Now we've got a new kind of suite of functions. And these input functions are kind of one of the keys to understanding Shiny. These are the things that these are the input side of the reactive aspect of Shiny. So we've got 2 inputs that we're putting in. And you'll see a lot of different sorts of input, like radio buttons, drop downs, sliders, and they all have some sort of descriptor and then input. And all of them start with an ID. And this ID is key. This is how you're going to how the rest of your code, when we start actually writing the server side code, is going to recognize these different inputs. And we'll give it a label, which is human friendly. Make sure so we can read it. And then there's different arguments depending on the inputs. In this particular one, we're looking at this is a drop down, and we're giving it these choices. We say you can choose either 70, 75, 80, 85, or 90. Here we've got a slider input, so you'll see those first 2 arguments are the same. In fact, a lot of times you won't even see people specify the name. You'll just say slider input bins, common number of bins. But now since we have a slider, we need to give it a range, the minimum value it can take, the maximum value it can take, and the default value. So that's all in the sidebar. And in the main panel, we're still not up to full interactivity where we have, where you're changing the inputs and you're getting a visualization that's changing. But I'll just show you a couple of things that you can, you can embed a local image if you want to, put something in, or you can, these BRs, if you do know a little HTML, you might realize, okay, that's like the BR tag. That's just an easy way to put that in right into your, inject some basic HTML right into your app. So let's stop our previously running one and hit run app. And cool, so it's, getting a little bit more like something we want. We've got some at least what feels like interactive. We can interact with it, pick different numbers, move our slider around. We actually have something to look at over here, but it's still, there's nothing there's no logic in the back end. We're not, running a visualization. We're not generating a table, and we're definitely not connecting anything that we're doing here to, our code that's running to put results over here. So finally, let's get on to talking about the server. And I'm switching it up a little bit here and introducing some data to play around with. This is the HIS data package, and this is just cholera data from the London cholera epidemic of the 19th century, John Snow. And we're changing things a little bit here to accommodate that data, but not really. We still have our slider input. I think we may have changed the range a little bit there. But now we've got something a little bit different in the main panel. Before we were just loading that RStudio logo and a little bit of text. Now you can say like we had the inputs up here. Now we've got outputs. So anything, if you think about your whole app is, the user specifying input and the app taking that input and returning a specific, showing a specific, combination of visualizations and tables and, a certain output corresponding to that input. This is where all of your outputs go. All of your outputs get wrapped in these output functions. So there's, plot output, there's corresponding ones for tables, for text. If you want to dynamically render our markdown, there's an output for that. And similar to, you have this input ID for each of your inputs, all of your output IDs have an output ID. So now hopefully you're starting to see that, you've got all of these different, IDs and components. And really, if you have that sketch laid out, you can, label them with, this is the ID for that, this is the ID for that, and just makes things a lot cleaner to, as you're building this up, if you have that kind of map in your, rough sketch already, laid out ahead of time. And finally, we have some server logic that, this was empty until now. And I'm going to emphasize that this is mostly just our code. So we're going to ignore most of it for the moment, or, ignore these, render plots and stuff for the moment. And session had to reconnect.
That was my bad. That was my bad. Sorry about that.
Yeah, no worries. Reconnected, and yeah, didn't lose anything. Great. Yeah, so this is all just our code right here. Now, so you call it ggplot. We're giving it the data set. We're giving it the x value. We're telling it to, fill. We're telling it to do a histogram. Down here, we're making a box plot. And that's great. And what we're doing here is now we're starting to use those labels. We're saying that, yeah, we're creating this, this plot, but we're going to put it in this, this histogram. We're going to put that in the this output ID. So we've kind of created a space in our user interface for the histogram, and we're going to say, okay, we're going to put this there. and we wrap it in this render plot so that ultimately when our inputs change, this listens to those inputs and will update it only when, so it's not only when the inputs change. So it's not continually redoing. If you change one component, it's not redoing your entire app. It's just loading, the part that's, recomputing the part that needs to be computed. Similarly for the box plotting. So let's run this, see what it looks like. And cool, we have something that actually looks like a useful Shiny app. We've got our slider, we've got 2 plots here. But there's one thing missing, and see if we're changing the number of bins, obviously we want the number of bins in our histogram to change, and it's not doing that. And the reason why it's not doing that is I'm just telling it to take the entire data set, compute a histogram, throw it in here. There's nothing tying it back to the number of bins that I have. And I could add that as an argument here. But if I specify, say, like number of bins equals 10 or 20, whatever, then that's still hard coding it in. I need it to listen to the input. So finally, let's open up this last one. This is pretty similar, but I've added in, this is kind of more just for you to play around with on your own time if you want, just a different way of structuring it. So you see, instead of having just a sidebar layout, I've kind of got that nested within this tab set panel. So it's just a different way of organizing your app, giving, if you have a lot of components, you kind of want to break these across different pages to make it a little bit easier to navigate. But the main thing that we want to focus on is here, where now we have a histogram, and now we've changed it to a scatter plot. But instead of just filtering, putting in the entire data set, we're filtering it into the specific input that we've created. So you can see that water input. Scroll up. Right here, under this radio button input, we have an ID called water input. So anytime that radio button is changed, a different one is selected, that's gonna, this function here is listening for that change. And when it changes, it's going to rerun this bit of code with that value of water input. So if you're going for, you're just playing around with a data set and you build up some cool plots, you can often just stick your existing code directly into your server function, wrap it in render plot, and usually just need to change a few, one or maybe sometimes more inputs to, instead of doing it by water input, you just have to prefix it with input $. And you'll see over here in our original code too, there's, the input now, instead of just histogram, we're showing the listening to that bin count variable. So now I can move this and it's doing what we expect. Show just a few bins, a lot of bins. Now it's broken up. Instead of having another plot underneath here, select, okay, want to look at scatter plot, and we want to look at the scatter plots of number of houses by death rate. We want to do this separately for each water source. So now here, this is where I'm selecting like New River. Now I'm selecting Q, and that water input ID is changing, and this is rerunning. So and then it's outputting it to the output object named scatterplot, which we've selected here. And that's the core logic within Shiny. You have inputs that have IDs. When those change, the server functions that listen for them recognize that change, recompute the visualization based on that change, and then output it into the slots that you've specified, these outputs with the corresponding ID. Cool, so that concludes this module, kind of building up the logic. Everything from this point on is going to be kind of playing around with different ways of laying things out, maybe a little bit more complex apps, some more interactivity. So check in here and see if there are any questions.
Yeah, Mike, let me quickly take a look and see what
Cool.
are some questions that we've got that you can quickly discuss. Let's see. Yeah, here's one. So do you have any tips for naming IDs? They say they think this becomes important for more complex Shiny apps when there are many identical widgets, i.e. many text inputs.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's kind of one of the areas that can really snowball quickly, especially if you're just playing around with the data set and you make a couple of, cool plots and you're like, oh, let me turn this into a shiny app. And, you create a simple Shiny app and you're like, oh, but it would be cool if it did this and it would do this. And then pretty soon it can be pretty easy to have, some monster with a bunch of different inputs that are interacting in really complex ways. And again, that's why just kind of like stepping back and have it like and that's totally fine for, for interactive, just building things up, prototyping. But at some point, you kind of have to step back and be like, well, this is getting more complicated. Take a step back, kind of refactor it out, have a better layout, try to identify, do you have redundant inputs that, can some be combined? And then sit back and like, take a few minutes to like make that sketch, think about how the different parts are interacting. And then if you really truly do have like identical code, like maybe say we were just creating like the same like histogram over and over again, but it was just getting replicated in a lot of, essentially the same code was getting replicated in a lot of different parts, then what was earlier question about Shiny modules, that would be a solution to that.
Cool, thank you. And then I see one other question coming in here, which would be a good one to discuss is, what are some good ways for hosting Shiny apps? For example, can it be hosted on GitHub? What are some recommended services that you would say for hosting Shiny?
Yeah, another great question. I'm going to cover this a little bit in the wrap up too, but there's, a few different options. Ultimately, Shiny apps are just web apps and they can be run on any server. So right now I'm just running that locally. Well, it's on RStudio Cloud, but it's just using that cloud server as a local server. You can do the same thing on like RStudio in your desktop browser. The obvious limitation is that you can't share it with anyone. Or to share, you have to send your code. They have to have all the, RStudio, all the right packages installed. They have to, run it. There's some easy ways with shinyapps.io. Then there's also within RStudio Enterprise suite of software, there's RStudio Connect that allows you to essentially, don't believe I'm connected to a Connect server right now, but you can publish a Shiny app just right from RStudio.
And then if you have time for one more question, cool. I have a couple more, but it's all, has however many questions you want to take right now.
Right.
Another one is, how do you parameterize Shiny apps? For example, if you wanted to run the same report, but for different segments, is it easy to do this? How would you do that?
That is a good question. In some sense, Shiny is kind of taking care of the parameterization because it allows you to select different values. But yeah, say you wanted the same plot and or the same app, but you only wanted it limited to a particular year, a particular data set, particular time frame. Actually, might bounce this to Phil if you're there.
Yeah, I'm here. I'm not sure if I'm able to submit through the chat box as the person overseeing it. So I sent the link to Samantha, and there's a couple different ways to dive into this question. I think how I would tackle it is integrating R Markdown with Shiny. And so really what you end up doing is using R Markdown as the report template or the report engine for your Shiny app. And so in the example that I just sent Samantha, what it lets you do is basically use
the chat.
Oh, okay, it's in the chat, fantastic. So basically you can use the option in Shiny there within this application that I shared through the chat box. and it will let you pick different variables or different parts of the data that you have. And then what it will do is dynamically and reactively change the visualization. And then for that state, you can actually use our markdown in the server folder in the Shiny Apps folder to actually use our markdown to generate reports. So this is a nice example of how you can use our markdown as kind of the behind the scenes report engine, and gives you that capability of generating reports directly from your Shiny app. And it's another reason why in the workshops I teach, sometimes I'll really try hard to make sure people understand the connection between our markdown and Shiny, not only because you can turn our markdown reports into Shiny apps, but because of this other way to approach reports via Shiny apps and using our markdown. So yeah, so that's probably how I would tackle it, but there's definitely other ways to go about this. And so yeah, but that one's pretty simple and a nice clean example to work from. So.
Cool, awesome, yeah, thanks, Bill. And yeah, and actually we'll have an example on that that format of turning an R markdown document, embedding Shiny into it at the end of the workshop.
Yeah.
I guess I think I saw one other question I can answer really quickly about using custom plotting code, and the answer is yes. We're using kind of building up our own custom ggplot here. If you wanted to use, say, base R or a different, entirely different library for visualization, you could put that code in here. It's just whatever output that ggplot, base R, plotly, whatever puts out is going to get passed through an appropriate render function that'll then place that output in the right spot of your app. So absolutely, you can create that's kind of the entire idea behind it. You can create your own custom visualizations, and of course make them reactive and dynamic.
Cool. So I saw a few more questions come in, but Mike, how are you feeling about time? Should we go ahead and maybe take a 5-minute break? Do you want to keep on chugging through? Do you want to do some questions? It's what do you feel like doing right now?
All right, cool. Yeah, maybe now would be a good time for a break, and then like I said, we've kind of at this point we've covered the core concepts, and then from now on it's just kind of making it cooler layouts, more complex interactivity, that sort of thing. So yeah, let's take 5 minutes now.
Perfect. We'll take a 5-minute break, and then let's join again at it's 2:53 right now. So let's go ahead and join at 3 o'clock. But we'll probably have to be wrapping up probably around 3:30 at the very latest.
Sounds great.
All right, sounds good. So with that, then I'm going to hand it over to Kevin. If Kevin, you want to just go through and show that video again, or maybe do any overview on ProCogia, and we will give Mike a break.
Thanks, Samantha. I will go ahead and share my screen again, and I might actually, instead of just playing the slides silently, if there's anybody who's hanging around during the break, I can walk us through the slides. So again, thanks to everybody for sticking around for this Pharma X session as part of the RStudio Global event. I hope everybody's signed up for different seminars and presentations throughout the global event. It should be pretty interesting, and really excited to see how it's panned out. And I hope when things are back to normal, we retain some sort of global element to this conference, because I think it really provides a really good opportunity to be a bit more inclusive of people around the world who can't make it to the physical event. But with that being said, just want to give a quick talk through of ProCogia for anybody who's still around. And again, these slides were flashing around earlier, but just to reiterate what Mike had said at the start of his presentation, how we're an end-to-end data solutions provider. So again, we mainly concentrate on the data space. So if it has nothing to do with data, that's really where we're interested in having an impact. And so we started off as a consulting firm focusing on data science and making an impact there. But we quickly realized that in order to provide true value to your customers, you got to really be involved from the start to the end. There's just too many important moving parts from the start to the beginning. So from that advisory stage where you're talking about planning out what your architecture is going to be, a lot of companies moving from on-premise infrastructure to on-cloud infrastructure, or maybe just moving from Excel sheets to databases, and whatever stage of the data journey they're at, we like to meet with the clients, figure out where they're at and where they would like to get to, and help them architect that solution. And we've started to help them then actually setting up that infrastructure through our engineering practice. And then where it gets really interesting and fun is where a lot of things, I think of the people in this conference, in our studio conference and the Pharma conference, are interested in. And that's around the business intelligence and data science and analytics. And that's, you know, where we have a lot of people who work for us then with a lot of knowledge in the open source data science tool sets. So a lot of R users in our company, Python. And we like to help our customers gain insights through dashboard development, whether it be through RStudio or other platforms. Like you see Power BI there as well, is a very popular one these days. And yeah, as Mike is walking us through here on the Shiny apps, and a lot of organizations, especially in the pharma industry, love to use Shiny, and I can't blame them because it's a fantastic tool. Really allows a lot of flexibility, and it's my tool of choice. If I had the choice of which tool to use, it's the one I always tend to gravitate towards. And then of course, you know, the more data science, more advanced analytics that you can get to do, where you can start coming up with some predictive and even prescriptive analytics, where, you know, we're not just telling you where your data is going, but we can help you figure out what to change in order to gain the kind of outcomes that you desire inside of your business operation. Very popular, I think, in the manufacturing setting now, as they start to get into machine automation and stuff like that. I think that's where prescriptive analytics is going to have a big impact, and that obviously impacts the pharma industry with respect to their manufacturing processes, etc. So yeah, a lot of really exciting things going on in data science, analytics, and specifically with prescriptive analytics. When that starts to really take hold, I think we'll see some really amazing innovations in pharmaceuticals. So just some of the areas that you can get in touch with ProCogia and you know, using data science, machine learning to help improve patient care, help improve effectiveness of drug trials, become more targeted in your sales marketing, and of course accelerating drug discovery and development, which is a very popular use case for artificial intelligence in the pharma industry right now, using the likes of neural networks, etc., to really gain the power of data science and high compute power to come up with some really cool innovations in the drug space. This is just a quick overview, again, of the general approach that we like to take at ProCogia. So similar to that first slide I showed, where we go end to end. So it's all about figuring out where your business is at and where it wants to go to. And after we've done that, we've kind of assessed what kind of needs you have, starting to put in the plan in place to move your company towards a more data-driven approach. And through our approach and partnership, we're able to drive some actionable insight there. These are just a sample of some of our previous clients, existing clients, and key partners that we work with. So RStudio being the main one on showcase today. We love working with those guys and helping evangelize for the RStudio and Team Suite, which we believe is one of the most powerful integrated environments for analytics and data science out there. And we do a lot of work helping deploy that on cloud. So whether that be AWS or Azure, we think that this is the way forward for RStudio deployments, and really helping life science partners move to the cloud securely is a big focus for us.
Cool. And it looks like with that, we are exactly at the top of the hour.
Lovely.
Why don't we, Kevin, go ahead and I'll hand it over to Mike, who's going to take us on our final sections with Shiny for the last 30 minutes of today's workshop. So, Mike, I'm going to make you the presenter, and it's great to have you back.
Cool. I think I'm showing my screen a little bit smoother than last time.
It looks like it's the mastering Shiny screen right now.
Yes, exactly. So I saw one question about downloads, and none of this is built into the material on the webinar, but I just want to quickly say that yes, you can upload and download. And this is kind of the go-to reference book, Mastering Shiny, and it essentially works by, there's instead of within your interface, you specify like download buttons and links. Those get connected to actions so that when you click on them, it triggers, in this case, write CSV to a specific location of your input data set, but you can also do the same sort of things like saving images. So yeah, check that out if you're interested in learning more about that. And let me get reconnected here. And cool, good to go. So I'll actually show an example of a different way to say if you just wanted to turn a different way that kind of as a side effect allows you to download a plot. This kind of also ties into the question of like, can you use customized graphics or different packages? Say you wanted to, let's just run this. This is under the fancy app, the first gapminder.r. Let's just run this app. If you just scroll through, you can see that it's quite a bit more complicated. We'll go through that kind of section by section here in a minute, but it's a little bit more helpful, I think, just to look and see what it actually does, and then when we get to different sections, you can tie it back to what's happening in the running app. So we've got a slider. We've already seen that before. In this case, it's filtering on year. So now we're kind of, now we're looking at between year, 1973 and 2011. And we're selecting a country, so we're looking at just Morocco. And we can, select different countries. It's showing year versus life expectancy. And we're also showing, this is, we've only showed plots before. Now we're showing a table, and this is visualized using the data table package, which is actually just kind of a wrapper to an underlying JavaScript library that, again, if you don't know JavaScript, you don't have to think about it at all. So that's the DT package. And we're doing a bit more, complicated things to our data set as well. So we're using this Gapminder data, but of course Gapminder has a lot of countries other than these, and we're also doing some kind of collapsing regions. So we got North America. We're doing some wrangling, some pre-processing, and in all of our other apps, we've kind of done everything within. There's been, it's like library Shiny, a big UI block, a big server block, and then the last line runs the app. If you do need to do some pre-processing, you can do in two ways. You can pre-process your data set beforehand and then just call that data set's ready to go. But if you need to do a little minimal pre-processing within the app, you don't necessarily want to include that in the server function because it might get called more times than it needs to be, and that results in your app being a little bit slow and less user-friendly.
Sorry, I'll try not to do that again. Sorry.
No worries.
I'm just making sure that I'm behind the scenes, making sure things are going okay. So sorry about that.
Yeah, no, awesome. Appreciate it, Phil. Yeah, so here we're doing some, again, if you don't know dplyr, don't worry about this, but just think about this. We're just doing some data wrangling. We're specifying the countries that we want to count as West, we're mutating, creating this region group with the case when statement. You know, SQL, it's kind of analogous to that. If it's the region's in West, we're calling it West. If it's in one of these countries, we're calling it East Asia, etc. Yeah, dropping some missing data, creating a couple of new columns, and then we have a new data set to work with, you know, called Gapminder. And then we switch into, you know, our shiny stuff. So we've got our user interface and and then down here our server logic. Let's run this again and get it going. Cool. So yeah, we've got our input ID, year input, that's year, and that's going into the slider. We've got a drop down. We've seen those before. Select input and select slider input. And we've got our main panel, which we're, you know, calling the output cool plot. So, you know, you can call this whatever you want to, but obviously if you're building this up to something more complex, cool plot is not going to be really descriptive when you come back to your code later, or someone else looks at your code and tries to figure it out. But you know, any string there is going to be, you can give it any name that you want. This is new, so we have our output. You know, we've got our plot output. We've seen that before, but the table that we've got down here needs a different output. Shiny is not going to know how to process that as a plot because it's not a plot image. So we give it, you know, we have this function dt output, and corresponding within the server, you know, we've got this chunk here. You know, it's calling render plot, doing some filtering. You know, we're not redoing all of that data wrangling that we did up above. We're starting with the output of that data wrangling, and we're just doing some additional filtering. So that's, you know, the filtering based on where we put these sliders. In this case, you know, we've got that input, year input. You can see it's actually now a list of, you know, length 2. So the first element's going to be that lower endpoint. Second element's going to be that upper endpoint, and you're filtering for years in between. And then we're taking in another country input here. We're doing that filtering, and then we're creating our plot. And we're doing a similar sort of thing for the output. And instead of render plot, we're doing render dt. So we're creating this new data set called filtered as just a data frame, and anytime one of these inputs changes, it filters the data set to just that, and then renders that in the slot that we specified for the for our table to be. And then of course, always need this at the end to actually run your app. I'm gonna show one thing really quickly. Say you're familiar with the Plotly library. And you want to turn this into, instead of a ggplot, you want to make this interactive and turn this into a Plotly graph. You can actually do that really easily without, you know, probably modifying just like 3 or 4 lines of code. So we're going to call the Plotly library. And when we go down here, instead of plot output, there's a function called Plotly output. So add a couple of lines there. Similarly with this, we've got, instead of render plot, we need to do render Plotly. And then Plotly has a function called ggplotly that will convert a ggplot object to a Plotly object. And I find the simplest way to do this is actually just to give your plot, you know, save your plot as a, you know, give it a name, call it P, and then we can just, now we have that same plot, same ggplot that we had before. Now we're just gonna turn that into a Plotly object. I think if we reload this, there we go. You can see now we've turned this into a Plotly object with everything that, you know, comes with Plotly. So we can hover over the points. And I also mentioned this because if you wanted to download a copy of that, Plotly has that built in. So that's probably not the official solution for upload download, but if you just need one plot downloaded, that's also kind of a hack for that. And again, like there was only, I think, maybe 4 or 5 lines of code needed to be changed there. What time do we have? I'd really like to spend a little bit of time on the last module. And since just kind of going through all these without kind of the, being able to wander around and look at everyone's screens and help out, I'm going to skip over this exercise, but encourage you to look at it if you're, want to play around a little bit more and kind of test your understanding. This is, if you go ahead and run this as is, of course, it's not going to run. It's got a bunch of kind of underscores as placeholders. So if you go through and either compare to the previous one for certain bits, and then this will build up a more complicated app with adding in some more functionality, and encourage you to go through that and on your own time if you're interested. So finally, I'm going to move on to Flex Dashboard, and this is kind of taking a step back a little bit. We started out with R Markdown, then it went into Shiny apps, and so they have this structure with the user interface and server, and inputs to that are specified in the user interface. When those change, server logic is watching, listening for that, and then it reruns whatever code or visualization that you've got based on those inputs, and then outputs it to your final output in your app. We're going to go back here, and actually this is just a strict R Markdown document, and this kind of gets back to that question that we had earlier about parameterizing. So this right here, we're going back to our original FDA data, looking at adverse events. This is exactly the same. In fact, it's almost exactly, we're going to do it pretty much recreate that R Markdown in a Flex Dashboard format. So there's a couple of things here. The output is specified as Flex Dashboard, specifying the orientation is going to be in columns. You specify that as rows, just depending on how you want to organize your app. This R code here is all the same, your normal R Markdown chunks. Again, we've seen that code before. And okay, now we've got some new stuff. So we've got columns with label 2 headers, these dashes. And then within that, we've got these level 3 headers, the triple hashtag, specifying all events, age range, events by gender. And this is specifying columns within our dashboard. And this is specifying another column, and we're going to put 2 rows within that. So it's kind of building up this grid sort of layout. And if we run it, or actually our Markdown, we're going to knit. Going back here, you can see I didn't actually put any code in here. This isn't outputting any graphs or anything, so it's all empty right now. But we've got that first column and then that second column with 2 rows in it, and it's kind of, this is, instead of having the user interface, you're specifying the layout within this Flex Dashboard package. This structure specifying columns and rows. So that's kind of the basic skeleton for setting it up. Let's go to adverse events, and we've got pretty much the same thing here. We've added a new thing here, a parameter. So this is parameterized report. In this case, we're specifying it for aspirin. Again, our code to grab the data and execute the query, create our age range. And now we've got that same column, all events, and column with age range and events by gender, the same structure. But now we're gonna do a little bit, put some plots in here and put a little bit of information on what age we selected, that sort of thing. So let's close that out. Give this a moment to load. There we go. So you can see that our parameter that we specify, drug aspirin, is there. We've got our age range in that upper bit. We specified to use an icon in there. We've got our 2 plots, and that's great. Kind of cool, clean looking interface. It's parameterized, so say we want to go back and run this say on Tylenol. Yeah, it's parameterized. It's going to run that. Just give it a minute there. But of course, it's reproducible, easy to like regenerate for different drugs, but it's still obviously not as friendly and not as interactive like a Shiny app is. Okay, so here we go. Now we've got it for Tylenol. So let's go to the last example here. So adverse events Shiny. We're going to take that previous dashboard that we had and turn that into an interactive one where instead of having to specify, your drug as a parameter, you can just select it. And a quick scroll through, it looks pretty similar to what we had before in terms of layout. We've got these columns, rows specified inside, and then we've got all of our, ggplots to, build up the visualizations. We've got some more stuff going on up here. I can go through all of it, but you can see that we're specifying a Shiny runtime. This is going to allow us to embed Shiny right in the dashboard. This is all the same. Grab our data. And now we've got this first column, which we're formatting as a sidebar. And so you can see this is Shiny. It's, the text, we've seen slider input before. Text input is allows us to directly input text. And, this is our input ID, and that's going to be our label and the default value. Slider, but you can see missing from this entire thing is the UI. And again, Flex Dashboard and Shiny is taking care of that for you in the background, and you're just specifying your inputs here. You're creating a new data set, and it's wrapped in this reactive statement, and that reactive turns this from just regular code to a reactive object that listens for changes in your input. So in this case, again, we're looking at that slider and saying, okay, we're gonna, whenever either the upper or lower endpoint changes, we're gonna recreate that age label. And then, same thing with male and female. So then we have, data set for male, data set for female for that particular age range and drug. And then going down here, instead of just our ggplot like we had in the last regular Flex dashboard example, we've got everything wrapped in render plot. And again, this isn't within server logic. Kind of this is all taken care of for you under the hood. And you can just quickly take whatever plot you've developed in prototyping, kind of maybe add a little bit of filtering or wrap it in render plot, and you can embed it right within your inside your dashboard. So let's go ahead and run documents. And cool, so this looks kind of the right part of this, ignoring that left column, looks exactly like what we had before. We've got an age range, our plots, the main distribution bar chart for adverse events. But now, say we want to go back and look at aspirin. Hit enter, and we've got one of, I think we looked at Keytruda initially. There we've got, so now we've got that interactive flexibility built up into that dashboard structure. One thing I'll quickly note on this is running as a Shiny document. So the Flex dashboard itself, just the regular dashboard, is an HTML that you can send to someone else. They can open it up in their browser. This does require a server that's running R in kind of one of the solutions that we briefly touched on, using like Shiny Apps or .io, RStudio Connect, hosting it on your own in some way. So this does require a server to be running Shiny. Well, looks like we've got about 10 minutes left before a hard stop. So let's see if anyone has any questions.
I'll take a look and see what we've got in the chat. Here, I've got one. So what is a good way or a recommended way to test Shiny apps? Do you use the Shiny test package?
Oh yeah, good question. So on one, I guess there's, Shiny apps are made of a whole bunch of different things. You've got the stuff that's specific to Shiny and kind of how it's all packaged together, and the reactive programming, and that, of course, you want to test. And then you might, as you build up a more complex app, you might also just have like regular functions that you're importing in that just do a particular task, and you want to make sure that those stay the same. So then, of course, good programming practices are important in developing and documenting those functions. And we've already heard in this session about things like Roxygen and test that to make sure that you're documenting and testing testing code that you've previously written as you update and make modifications. The Shiny test package is also great. It kind of will run a bunch of tests on your Shiny app as it like all integrated, so that instead of having to like spin it up, have a bunch of different people look at it, and then someone be like, oh, like this drop down menu doesn't update this graph in the right way, or this isn't working, or you go here and then there, and then all of a sudden it breaks. It does a lot of that sort of testing for you. So I think that's also a good path for testing.
Great, thank you. And then I think we have enough time for one more question. And it looks like Carlos answered it in the chat, but I loved his answer. So let me go ahead and ask this question as well. And Carlos, if you want to jump on and answer as well, you're welcome to. But let's say you have a quite expensive setup function. Is it better to interactively, if when each interaction is triggered, or put it externally outside of everything? I imagine a situation in which you could have many of them. So putting everyone outside could be slowing down the startup, but the navigation will be smooth, as the opposite of making the startup quick, but slowing down the usability. In that situation, what would be a good strategy to refactor the app?
Hi, can you guys hear me?
Yep. Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah, so it's a very interesting question, and when I was reading through it, I was thinking, how would I do that? So it for small applications like the ones that Mike has been showing, I don't think there would be any issue of having the functionality of the app inside of the application or outside the application. As practice, I normally tend to do the pre-processings before the data goes into the app, and that is applied to any other kind of visualization work that you do. Like if you're using Django and JavaScript, then you would be doing all of the pre-processing on the database of Django, and then you will be putting the outputs directly into a chart.js library or something like that. Or the same with Power BI or Tableau, all of these tools. You will be using the database to do the pre-processing, and then those other tools would be receiving the clean data. So for this question, to answer this question, if the application is too complex, then I would recommend to use a database to do all of that work before the data goes out.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thanks, Carlos. Yeah, exactly. That's putting, I think, kind of as a general rule of thumb, putting as little as possible in the server logic, because that's what's going to get triggered interactively, and then doing as much as possible before you even go into the app. So yeah, any wrangling, processing, modeling that can be done before, that can be done, beforehand, and then you just pull in the clean data set. That's will speed it up as well.
Yep, and I just shared a link with Samantha about Joe Chang's keynote at the 2019 RStudio conference, where he talks a lot about scaling Shiny and managing it in production. And so it's a really good talk, and it also talks about the things that Carlos just mentioned. So
awesome.
Yeah.
While we're on that topic, I'll show this as well. Are you able to see my screen here? I've got some like a resources slide.
Yes, we can see it. And then I also shared the talk, Joe Chang's talk YouTube in the chat for everyone.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, like I briefly showed this Mastering Shiny book, which is a great intro and kind of getting a broad overview. If you're really going into those issues of like trying to like do stuff at production grade, this book, I'm actually not sure if that's been fully released yet. It might still be a work in progress. It is also a really good source for those sorts of problems.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Mike. And thank you to everyone here. Let me quickly wrap this up for everyone. All right, so thank you again to everyone that has joined us today for the RStudio Global R in Pharma X session brought to you today by ProCogia. If you haven't registered for RStudio Global, which I hope most of you have, go ahead and do that now. Our 24-hour marathon of events kicks off on Thursday. For everyone that did join us today, materials will be available, materials and videos for sessions that we can share will be made available for you via email and online following RStudio Global conference. I've saved most of the questions here, so if there's any that we are able to follow up on, we can do that through our RStudio community. And once again, thank you to all of our wonderful presenters today for sharing all of their industry expertise. Thank you, everyone, and we'll see you at Global.